Discourse and Dialogue. In the spirit of the season, we're going to do a little sermonizing today, all right? And the theme of this sermon is putting the masses back in Christmas. We're going to talk about the ethics of it all. We'll begin with something more recent than 2,000 years ago. Act so that the maxim of your actions as examples of how to behave or rules of conduct can be used by all as a universal law for a harmony of ends. This is referred to as the categorical imperative and was developed by Immanuel Kant. A categorical imperative is an unconditional moral obligation which is binding in all circumstances and is not dependent on a person's inclination or purpose. It has taken 10,000 years, and we still haven't learned it, that for people to figure out or to be taught that all human cultures, no matter what, have a moral code, an ethics, or a set of rules to live by. The principal religious works, the Torah, the Bible, and works you're not supposed to mention, all see as everyone else is evil and immoral, and they're the ones with the answer. They're the only ones with a moral rectitudinous code. Everybody else is enemies of some sort. And it took until Kant had developed this concept. He says, all cultures, barbarian, savage, aristocratic, they all have rules of conduct. They all have a set of principles that you're supposed to act by. No matter how barbarian they may be, there's still sets of rules by which you conduct yourself. And he says, so what is it about them? What is the principal characteristic of all moral systems, no matter what they are? And that's where he came up with this categorical imperative. It says your behavior should set an example, and it should be such that anyone could behave the way you're behaving for living together, for living in a community and cooperating. So that's what the thing says here. So Kant said that an imperative is something that a person must do. In our language, the term must do is a little bit flimsier or more general. For example, if a person wants to stop being thirsty, it is imperative that they have a drink. It's as simple as that. So Kant said an imperative is categorical when it is true of at all times and in all situations. And so he's saying one of the things that's true in all times and in all situations, in all ethical systems, is that you should act in an exemplary way so others can act that way also. The concept or the phrase must do is what we call in languages, in linguistics, a mood or a mode of speech that impels. And you're familiar with it when people refer to law And you see the arguments and stuff going on in the legislature, and the must and shall. The whole must and shall thing is there's an impulse, and the language impels an action. And for us, the term must has basically two meanings. The practical meaning, you must stop at a street light, at a red light. And the general, what should you do when driving? Right? You follow the rules, right? A practical example is to walk on water, you must know where the rocks lie, just under the surface. And here's the important part, or you'll fall in the water. So there's a positive, affirmative impulsion in a moral directive, but there's a subtler negative or else component. And generally, when it comes to conduct in society, the or else is we break our harmony, we break our cooperative relationship. This is what the Republicans and Democrats are talking about. We'll get into that in a different speech. In general, to do good or act ethically, something of which our president has absolutely no sense, you must know what impels or is required for something to be ethical. The common property among all ethical systems, whether religious, military code, or cooperation in a society, or savage, be it savage or barbarian, is a necessary impulse or categorical imperative compelling you to do right within that system. This is the idea that Huck Finn wrestles with in his adventures. He's confused as to what's the right thing to do versus what is just his impulse. Should he turn over a slave when he doesn't want to do that? His impulse is to protect him. Yet he lives in a society that is slave society, in which it is illegal not to turn over an escaped slave. So he wrestles with these. Is the impulse just a selfish personal impulse, or is it ethically driven? And so he begins questioning the ethics of the rules and the law. And then he gives up on it and just does what he feels like doing. He just goes through his natural impulse, and he says, I'm not turning him in. If that means I go to hell, well, then I'll go to hell. I'm a sinner. The Sermon on the Mount was not simply telling us how to act. It was teaching how to set an example. What then was the practical ethical message through the miracles and the good deeds? What could any normal person take away from it and take as example? All the prescriptions are examples of a single principle for harmonious action. It's where the rubber of rhetoric hits the road of reality here. What's a practical application of this general principle here, this moral principle? And it comes down to this. To each according to their need, that each might give according to their ability. And that is what is meant by the phrase, I will teach you to fish for men. He's going to empower them and give them what they need for them to help people. You can find this principle of to each according to need, from each according to their ability, in fact, an examination of the Mount, and see if every prescription leads itself to this necessary imperative, to each according to need, from each according to ability. First, of course, The assumption is that this is a morality for the masses. He didn't care who was out there in the crowd. He knew that all people can be driven by a moral code. And that's where masses come in for us. So and we begin the Sermon on the Mount. They quote the stuff and they go to Matthew 5 when they should actually go to the end of Matthew 4, because right there it's laid out that his sermons are for the masses. Matthew 4:24, and his fame went throughout all Syria, etc. And 25, and there followed him great multitudes of people. And then in Matthew 1, he just begins it with that, and seeing the multitude, etc. Now, up until that time in the Greco-Roman world, they had priests in temples. And that whole idea of that there's high priests and there are priests and they know what best is and good is, and it gets conducted in enclosed spaces like testimony in the basement of the Capitol. Well, let's not get into that. Anyway, the point is he's doing just the opposite. In an open space, on a mount, in front of a lot of people, he's bringing them into the world of a moral code. And and he begins, before he gets into prescriptions of how to behave, he gets into this to each according to their need. It's the first thing he deals with. And he says all those needs are going to be taken care of. Matthew 3, those in poor in spirit, for that mourn, then the meek, hunger and thirst after righteousness, the merciful, peacemakers, the persecuted. Every one of those are a need which he claims is going to be taken care of or provided for, and he doesn't charge a dime for it. And then he takes the negative side too, about false witness, sort of like what the Republicans are now doing. The downside of it too. He says you're gonna pay for that. That you're gonna pay for. So you set an example. Act so that the maxim of your action can be used as a universal law for harmony of ends. And so now he presents in the next section that you should make of yourself an example. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on the hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. And then 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. So he's saying, act so that the maxim of your actions are good works, are setting example. Or else, Matthew 20, 21, and 22, whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And I would think that Trump is in a living hell right now. And that is seen in 20, 21, and 22. And in that, he says in 20, he says, if you're not better than those who claim to be the best, the priests and those kind of, then you ain't doing it. You can be and need to be better than even them. And he goes on with those. I'm not going to get into that. Then he goes into how to make amends. All right? 23, 24, 25, and 26. Interesting take on this here. You don't make amends by giving money to preachers. It's not how you fix problems. He says right here, before you do any of that, correct the problem that you have with your brother or with somebody else. You do that. Then you come over here and you thank me for teaching you to be such a moral and good person. But solve the problem first. Act so that your actions are an example to others. Then there's the other stuff that he gets into, which is pretty brutal: the adultery, the lust, the chopping off hands and plucking out eyes, and that's all socially relative. But it's interesting how he digresses or degenerates into the legalism of it all, and talks about a contract of divorce because women are chattel. See, so and then there's a lot of simple homily he talks about here: writing a contract for divorce, not swearing, not picking your nose and things like that. All these, Then he goes into things, examples of how you should behave and what you should do. It's interesting that he's talking about everyday stuff. He's not talking about high morality. He's talking about just conducting your life properly. And some of these things we have questions because we have different systems today and different beliefs. But that's the actual prescriptions are the last thing and don't rise to a very high level. But everything before it is what's important. He's saying the message is how to live, not what to do. This is not right. No, this is wrong. This is right. This is wrong. This is right. Yeah, I'll, do that stuff. But more importantly, how do you live when you're trying to do right? And how you live is by setting an example. And how you live is by giving to the best of your ability so that people can receive according to their need. It's not transactional. That's not a transactional thing. That isn't this for that. This isn't something you pay for. Because all people have to work and contribute. They all need to be healthy. So nobody should be having to pay for health care since the work of living is the work of of being healthy. And you can't do anything else without labor being healthy. So the important point is he didn't charge for the loaves of bread and fishes, because what he got in return was a lot more lasting. So, what do we conclude with? So, we all have the same choice to make now. Do we grow the economy by increasing the measure of capital accumulation, or do we invest some of those loaves and fishes for human consumption so we can build a more humane and comfortable world? The first is demanding, combative environment in order to make a buck. And the second, you are asked to do to the best of your ability what you can to make a wholesome world. That is what a Christmas present is all about. Thank you for the privilege of your time.